Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Sullivan. I'm the Consul General for Canada here in New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion tonight with a very interesting topic of other people's democracies. Is it any of our business? Now, this event draws on the work that's being done by the Democracy Support Project at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. And on behalf of the Government of Canada, I'd like to thank the Woodrow Wilson School for partnering with us. We appreciate it very much. There are two other events. There's a panel discussion similar to tonight that's going to take place at Princeton next Wednesday. And there is a luncheon at the United Nations on Friday. Now, the topic of tonight's panel discussion is certainly a foreign affairs issue that's faced by many countries today. And it's really, should a country become involved in the struggle for democracy of another country? And if so, how should it be done? And I think it's fair to say that Canadians, like their American neighbors, believe that individuals have the right to determine their form of government. And certainly Canadians believe that Canada, as a matter of foreign policy, should assist other individuals in other countries in terms of determining the kind of government that they do have. I think it's fair to say that history has proven that democracy is certainly the most effective way of achieving stability, prosperity, and human rights. And I think to a certain extent it certainly reflects the values of people certainly in North America and Canada, and in the longer run it serves our global interests. However, the goal of democracy really can't be separated from the means that's used to achieve it. And the legitimacy and the effectiveness of democracy promotion certainly depends heavily on how the assistance is delivered. Should and how can countries like Canada, the United States, advance democracy and human rights in an effective and respectful way? And this is the topic of our panel discussion tonight. We're very fortunate to have a very distinguished group of panelists with us tonight that have a wealth of diplomatic experience. And I'll just, I think they'll probably be introduced to a greater extent later, but I'll just mention we have former Ambassador Jeremy Kinsman, who served Canada as ambassador to the United Kingdom, Russia, Italy, and the European Union. And he's joined by two prominent American diplomats, former Ambassador Robert Hutchings, former Ambassador Mark Palmer, and Michael Edwards of the Ford Foundation. Now, Ambassador Hutchings is going to act as the moderator of the panel, and in advance, I'd like to thank the panel very much for being here tonight. They're certainly very well qualified to discuss the subject, and we're delighted to have them here tonight. And gentlemen, welcome, and again, thank you for being here. Just in closing, I just want to make the point that Canada believes that it has a very valuable and perhaps unique contribution to make in promoting democracy. Now, not unlike the United States, Canada can draw on its distinct perspective. And, it's had many years of developing a very open and functioning political system. It has a fair and transparent justice system. It has a very, robust and cooperative economy. It's a country that has a very diverse society, and it's a country with two languages, which is somewhat different from many other countries. And it has a strong belief in democracy and human rights, and we really feel as a country that we can make a unique contribution on the world stage. We have over many, many years, and will continue to work with the United States in this regard in advancing our common goals, certainly to the benefit of both countries and the benefit of the world in general. So on that note, I'm going to turn the discussion over to Mr. Hutchison, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here with this distinguished audience and panel. This is this discussion tonight is part of a series, I should mention, that is co-hosted by the Woodrow Wilson School as part of its New York Tolman Lecture Series, which will be encouraging serious debate about a range of pressing issues in public and international affairs. As Daniel mentioned, the topic is an interesting one. As a former Deputy Director of Radio Free Europe back way early in my career, and as a former Director of the U.S. Support for East European Democracy program, I suppose my biases are clear, but I've also traveled around the world to see parts of the world where U.S. and other democracy promotion efforts have been seen as cynical, as neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism in disguise, or just clumsy in producing outcomes that weren't intended at the very beginning. So I think this project, and Jeremy Kinsman in particular, are making a real contribution to the way we think about how democracy can be advanced around the world in a modest, in a humble way, rather than one that's made in USA or made in Ottawa, for that matter. So let me briefly introduce our panelists. Our time is short, so I don't want to give long introductions, but let me first mention my friend Ambassador Jeremy Kinsman, Princeton's class of 1963. His distinguished career as a Canadian diplomat, as Daniel mentioned, included service as Canada's ambassador to Moscow, to Rome, to the EU, High Commissioner in London, and permanent representative to the UN food agencies. I always feel sorry for him to have had such a boring diplomatic career, but some of those posts may have been all right. He is now with us at the Woodrow Wilson School this year as Diplomat-in-Residence. We're very glad to have him. And he is heading the Democracy Support Project for the Community of Democracies. After Jeremy, we'll hear from Michael Edwards, who is Director of the Governance and Civil Society Program at the Ford Foundation here in New York. Prior to joining Ford, he was Senior Civil Society Specialist at the World Bank, where he led a program designed to improve the agency's understanding of and engagement with a wide range of civic groups. Before moving to the bank, Michael spent 15 years as a senior manager in international relief and development NGOs. Finally, we'll hear from Ambassador Mark Palmer, with whom I go back quite a long way, who is president of Capital Development Company, which supports local partners in launching new enterprises in Washington, Europe, and Asia. Mark is a former U.S. ambassador to Hungary. He also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in charge of U.S. relations with the then USSR and to East Central Europe. He's also served as speechwriter for 3 presidents and 6 secretaries of state. He is a co-founder and board member of the National Endowment of Democracy and vice chair of Freedom House and the Council of Democracies, about which we'll hear more tonight. We'll hear from our 3 panels, and I may weigh in at the very end as a kind of cleanup batter if there's any provocations left to be offered. Thank you. Jeremy.
Well, good evening. Just a user-friendly warning. A gentleman at the back there is going to leave halfway through my speech. It's not a statement. He's my roommate from college, and he's going to the opera. I assume we're all Democrats here. I mean, small d Democrats, though the way the numbers are going, you might all be big D Democrats for that matter. But I'll skip the melody and the music of the words of democracy and cut to the chase of our discussion, which is about the billions of people still who are Democrats but who don't have democracies. And the question that we ask is obviously, why should we care? And the answer, after we have talked for some time, is not self-evident. Some people have been on this case for years. My friend and colleague, Mark Palmer, is actually the godfather of this democracy project. But you know, it is an uphill climb. I came into the United States about, 7 or 8 trips ago through Toronto Airport, where your grand country has a small outpost of its border security to see if we Canadians are suitable. And I came across a border security officer, a terrifically impressive African-American woman who was very angry at the guy before me. I don't know why, but she sent him off to secondary, and I think he's still there. But anyway, I was very meek. She said, "What are you coming to this country for?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing a democracy project in Washington and Princeton." And "What do you mean democracy? What are you doing?" "Well, we're seeing if we can help people who don't have democracy to have democracy." There was a long pause. She said, "Don't you think we've stuck our fingers enough in other people's business? Haven't we done enough damage?" And I didn't really have an answer, and she's got a point. And the point she's reflecting, of course, is about Iraq. And the use of democracy for that project, when the well ran dry on other reasons, has given people in the world worries about agendas. And globally, Mark's Freedom House issued a report 3 or 4 weeks ago showing that even after the great burst after 1989, there's been a retreat for democracy in the world. Some of this is happenstance. Things happen fast. Castro, Pakistan, happens all the time. Some of it is deliberate, encouraged by maybe alternative models that avoid some of the messiness of democracy. China, liberal authoritarianism, 7% growth, safety, and for the leaders, which is attractive, control. The UK Foreign Secretary gave a speech last week in Oxford about democracy, and he said something I think is ominously true, that even among us, even in North America and in Europe, there's a growing number of people who profess a new kind of realpolitik, that we're not going to be concerned about people's governance anymore in the interests of security or economics. But you know, despite all this, despite the complications, democracy still has a certain inevitability. It is happening, and it will continue to happen. And you here have 100 reasons to do with values, and all of you, and particularly experts like Michael, have 100 reasons to do with why functionally, practically, democracy works to solve the problems of people's societies. But I'll give you another reason Mark will talk about. You know, a democratic world is a safer world. It's a world in our interests. And also, I have to say, in caring about other people's democracies, you're joining what is a venerable tradition of solidarity. My old friend Frank Brecker over here from the State Department has written a few books about the United States and France at the beginning, and those two revolutions intertwined differently. The United States Revolution, the American Revolution, was about independence, and the French was about something much more complicated. It was about equality. The Americans were trying to protect property, and the French revolutionaries were trying to get their hands on the aristocrats' property. But that only goes to show that there's no one version of democracy which dominates. Today, the information revolution has totally changed expectations for democracy since Bob and Dick Rowson and others worked in Radio Free Europe. People today in the most remote corners of the world know what the norms are elsewhere. They know more or less what you have, what we have here. They know it because of technology. It's fascinating to see what technology did successively. The wall came down because of West German television, basically. And Tiananmen, the same year, happened. The kids, the students, they found connections to their student supporters and others outside in the world through fax machines. And in Manila, in Jakarta, Marcos, Suharto, they came down because of people texting each other messages on cell phones. In 2000, 2002, the color revolutions, it was all about the internet. And you would have seen in September in Burma and Rangoon what you saw of what was going on in Rangoon. You saw because of bloggers putting stuff up on the net. When these people reach out to the world this way, they're reaching out in the belief that they have a right to reach out to people like yourselves and a right to be helped. And we believe that you have a right to help. And in fact, those rights are enshrined in a variety of United Nations covenants. Those rights to help, subject to being consistent with international law. So I've said why I think we should care. The question is, what do we do? That's, in a sense, what this book, this very early version, is about. The book we're doing for the Council of the Community of Democracies. We're focusing not on theory. We got no grand theories. We're focusing on applications, concrete things. What's worked? What have governments actually been able to do in the last 30 or 40 years that have worked to support democracy activists and human rights defenders? And also, what hasn't worked? What's gone wrong? And what have we learned? I can give you 10 basic sort of rules, I guess, that are coming out of this. The first rule is that democracy cannot be exported. Because of two, what happens in a country depends on the people in that country. I'll quote an unlikely person in the United States, Salvador Allende, who said at the end, it's the people who make history. And in his country, and in most countries, he was right. But three, in making history, the people have to do it bottom up, which, four, requires a civil society. And building a civil society doesn't happen in a day. It takes time to build. And five, it's not necessarily political. Most women who have become involved in democracy movements got there through women's organizations, and kids through youth organizations, or people in causes, HIV/AIDS, or professional associations. In Rangoon, with the monks, the most prominent organization was the Rangoon Bar Association, and you saw it was the same in Pakistan. Culture. Culture is much more than culture. Culture spawns a whole system of samizdat underground publication beyond the control of the state. It's what begins, in a way, civil society. Six, it's very important to understand that in doing this, in trying to change things, only non-violence works. Violence doesn't work from inside because in repressive societies, the police can always out-violence anybody else, and in doing so, they will scare all the good people into going to ground. Seven, it's not easy. Transformation isn't easy, and it's not theoretical. I lived in Moscow in the early 90s when the Russians were going 180 degrees in assumptions, different to all of their reflexes for 4 generations. It's behavioral, and it can't be taught. It has to be learned as they go. And also, it's not easy because, as we know, democracy has to deliver. It has to provide safety. It has to provide prosperity, or it's simply not going to last. 8, free and fair elections are an important ingredient, indispensable, I guess, of democracy. But it's only the beginning. Someone wrote once that elections are to democracy like weddings are to marriage. Democracy is about the long haul. And countries, to make it work, need institutions. They need safeguards. They need an independent judiciary. They need something which is going to protect the rights of people who lose elections or minorities. Otherwise, what we have is what we've had in Kenya for the last 2 months. 9, there's no model for democracy. It's not the American model or the Canadian model or the French or the Scandinavian or anything else. Every country is different, and democracies find their authenticity in the cultures that they emerge from. And last, there is no end. It's never completed. Democracies can never be perfect. I'll quote another Chilean called Allende, the writer Isabel, who wrote that countries, like husbands, are always open to improvement. So all these complications and shadows, what they do show is how Democrats need our help. Michael will show what non-governmental organizations are doing, and Mark and I, in our work, defer enormously to them for what they're doing out there on the ground. But you know, governments can do a lot. Embassies, I've been at all these embassies. It sounds like another guy, actually. But embassies are changing. They've changed remarkably in our working lives. They're no longer just things government to government. They're now people to people. Embassies, if they're working, democratic embassies, they're working for you. And if they're working for you, they're connecting you to people in these other countries and connecting them back. They're now places for public diplomacy. I admit, in closed societies, it's hard. But in our study, we've showed how diplomats, many diplomats that we have chronicled, have managed to do it in apartheid South Africa, in Pinochet's Chile, in Burma right today, the American embassy is doing it. And Mark was in Budapest in 1989 and was almost a pioneer in doing this. And I won't say what happened in Budapest and Prague in '89 is exactly what's happening in Belarus today, but the people who are in Belarus today will learn reading about what Mark and his colleagues did 17, 18, 19 years ago. Of course, embassies don't only do democracy, they do economics, they do your security. But you know, you can do different things at the same time. One doesn't trump the other in China or in Russia or in Saudi Arabia. I'm not saying that because I'm making a speech. I'm saying it as a practitioner. I know that that is true. There's still government-to-government work. We still keep the pressure on governments. It's not all civil society. We keep human rights on the agenda with countries like China. We keep passing prisoners lists to the Chinese and to the Cubans. We keep talking about the rights of non-governmental organizations to exist in Russia and in Egypt. And we still speak in confidence to the leaders to try and effect change. In extremis, governments and embassies warn those leaders. They warn those leaders that they will be held personally accountable. In Kiev, during the Orange Revolution, the embassy there warned the leaders of Ukraine that if there was violence against the demonstrators, they'd be held personally accountable. If they turned off the cell phone system so they couldn't communicate, they would be held personally responsible. And it happened 2 weeks ago in Kenya. The United States, British and Canadian governments communicated that if there was any further incitement to tribal, ethnic violence, that those people would no longer, they'd be held accountable, would no longer be considered ever admissible to our countries. We target people with sanctions in Zimbabwe and in Burma, and I admit that after all, if Libya is going to give them money anyway in China, that probably doesn't make a hell of a lot of effect, except, you know, that people don't like to be targeted. And even people obsessed with power still like to fake the moves for democracy, to feign democracy. And look at Burma today. They're announcing they're going to be elections in 2 years. Of course, they're saying that Aung San Suu Kyi was married to a foreigner. She can't run. But the point is, maybe that'll be fixed. Let's hope. But this provides openings to connect to civil society, legitimate openings. And I'll just give you several aspects or examples. Embassies can fund groups, youth groups, to buy T-shirts, to put amplification at meetings, at public meetings, to do little things. And embassies can do it without any of the paperwork, you know. Just $10,000 to a women's group, to something like that, makes all the difference. They show support. Embassies and diplomats go to demonstrations and protests, and if those are banned, they go to the funerals, as they did in South Africa. And we train both sides to learn discipline, both protesters to avoid violence, and we try to train security forces also to avoid violence. Media, independent media is extremely important as an ingredient in emerging democracy. And training media doesn't have to be grand. There are Newman Fellowships at Harvard, but the Czechs go out and Burmese exiles on the Thai border get training from the Czechs, who have a great film culture, in knowing how to shoot and cut a tape and compose copy and edit copy. How to do the small things. Algeria, a country that, with Pam Peltrow, we remember well, and I think fondly, even though it was semi-totalitarian, and we have to face the truth. But I remember going back there 10, 12 years ago with a Canadian Prime Minister, I guess longer, and I remember we were doing several things there. We were helping start up new independent media outlets, papers. We were helping to train journalists. We were also helping the state organs, the El Mujahid, to actually learn how to write the news. And you know what I think the biggest help was when our Prime Minister, who was accompanied by usual unruly press corps from Canada, and they began to yell at a press conference questions at him about what he was doing about this scandal or this incompetent minister or when the hell was he going to call elections. The important thing about that wasn't the answers. It was the way the mouths dropped on the Algerian journalists' faces when they saw that in some countries, people actually speak truth to power. We showcase what's best in our societies, not for self-promotion, but because what's best in our societies isn't often what's in the paper. This university, Princeton, do you know in Beirut, right now, the approval rating for the United States government is down in single digits. But you know that the polls show the approval rating, the affection for America, is still in the high 70s. And you know why? It's because of civil society. Princeton University basically founded the American University of Beirut. And respect for American education and skills is still vastly, vastly more important than any momentary decline in respect for some of the current government's policies, which I'm not commenting on, but which the polls show are down in world polls. When things go wrong, as they do, diplomats protest, and they witness trials, and they verify the physical condition of prisoners. They do house calls on people who are under threat. And when they know that the wire is tapped, they make phone calls that they know are going to be listened to and support. And they communicate all this back to you on the outside. A colleague of ours, Ignacio Walker, who was the foreign minister of Chile, but before that was a human rights defender during Pinochet, says that he had hundreds of trials against the very biased judicial system, the judges that Pinochet appointed. He never won a trial. But because of the Catholic Church and different embassies always being there and publicizing what was going on back to you here, then it saved a lot of lives. And that's terribly important. In extremes, diplomats and embassies offer physical protection, extending their own immunity to people who are genuinely in physical threat. In Nepal, several years ago, we were talking about Nepal earlier, that diplomats escorted people who had been given asylum. They escorted them right to the gates of the plane to make sure they weren't arrested on the way. Of course, governments can take this badly, and they can threaten expulsions, but the cost to them are high. Let me close. Tyrannies, dictatorships, when they collapse, just think about it. They usually collapse very fast. And democrats, that's us, need to be ready. And that's why the community of democracies has organized this project. I want to emphasize the community of democracies is not a hostile bloc. It's not hostile to China. I like China. China, I respect its complex. I respect its history. I respect its importance and its psychology and its challenges. But I also respect the human rights defenders and democracy activists in China who should have a modicum of rights. Because if the community of democracy cares about these things, it does so because there is beneath it a much bigger community of democrats including people in these countries. And that's you and that's us. And that's our paradox. Democracy, by definition, is an exercise in self-government. It's about the people who live there. But by tradition and by necessity, it's also, and in truth, an exercise in solidarity. And it's done in the name of Democrats everywhere. And that's what this project is all about. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the invitation. I think I'm especially lucky to be here. Not only am I not, did I not go to Princeton, sadly for me, I'm not an ex-ambassador, but I haven't passed through the first and second stages of being an ex-ambassador, which is to be an ambassador and then be the ex. So I feel somewhat sort of disadvantaged, I guess, on the panel, but I'll do my best to speak from more of a, I guess, an NGO perspective that does bias and color my experiences. But all biases, I think, are welcome in a room like this. And I will speak from my experience as being the director of the Ford Foundation's program on democracy, although we don't call it that for an interesting and revealing reason, for the last 9 years or so. The reason is we wanted to call it the Ford Foundation's program on democracy, but because we worked in places, in parts of the world that felt uncomfortable with declaring that word, we had to find a more neutral and less threatening name for ourselves, so we became a governance and civil society program, but basically with a democracy program. So let me start by reaffirming that we also believe passionately that self-governance, democracy as self-governance, is the best political system for making decisions and resolving differences between human beings peacefully. And it's intrinsically valuable for human fulfillment and flourishing. So both instrumentally and intrinsically, we are passionate believers in the benefits of democracy. And across lots of different contexts, I think you do find three things which are particularly important for democratic institutions to be sustained. And they're not surprising, but I'll name them anyway. A government that sees itself as an instrument for equity and social justice and is accountable for its actions. A political system that guarantees equal voting rights and effective representation, and a civil society that's strong and inclusive enough to exert pressure from below over the long term. And when you find those three things acting in concert together, being mutually supportive, then democracy can function extremely well indeed. The problem is those cases are very few and far between, and usually you get one out of the three, maybe you get two out of the three, maybe you get some which are weaker than the others. As we've seen in Kenya recently and elsewhere, elections by themselves are only one component of what we need and can't guarantee good outcomes by themselves. So we do like to think of those three sets of institutions and forces at the core of our democracy work. But we also know that those three things and how they interact play out in 1,000 different ways across different contexts. So we don't see democracy as a universal template or an endpoint, if you like, based on the experience of one part of the world. Clearly, we can't export it, therefore. And I guess we see our goal rather simply in some ways as to help people address the long-term challenges of institutional development and relationship building in the civic and political arenas in ways appropriate to their context. So I guess we would focus more on the preconditions for enabling people to exercise and shape their own visions of democracy, even if it looks somewhat different to the models that we expect, even if it departs somewhat from the theories that we've been taught, even if it takes longer than the timescale which we might consider appropriate. China actually is a great example, already been raised. We have a major program in China on these issues, but it's not to do with representation. Although, of course, there are village elections in China. But we found that the most interesting and exciting and potentially, I think, influential experiences and experiments in what one might call democracy work in the Chinese context come from things like citizen participation in budget allocation at the municipal or the city level, or things like citizen polling that allow groups to have at least some say in what they consider to be important priorities to them in terms of their quality of life. And those things can introduce elements, at least, of voice and accountability into systems lacking formal democratic representation, and they can do it very effectively. So our work may be a little bit different from some other donors, but I suspect not that different. Let me give you a few other things that come to mind from our experience. First of all, and it's already been said eloquently, democracy is a journey, it's not a destination. Democracy is a process of deep contestation, actually, that unfolds over time and is rarely ever completed, through which citizens exercise their rights and gain deepening control over decisions that affect every aspect of their lives, not just the political. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. We know that even mature democracies, including my own in the United Kingdom, continue to disappoint. They continue to exclude, to marginalize, to diminish certain social and economic groups and certain aspects of democracy. So our work is never done, is the simple point. Democracy, when you think about it, is the reordering of patterns of power and authority throughout society. That's what it is. And you can't imagine anything more conflictual or sensitive than that. So secondly, context really matters. There's obviously no one-size-fits-all model here, and opportunities and mechanisms for political participation, whether it's formal or informal, had to be rooted in local meanings and shaped and struggled for, perhaps even died for, by citizens themselves. And we find that support for what I would call authentic politics, rooted authentic politics, never produces predictable results, which is a problem for agencies like mine, because we want to spend money on what works. But it's a much better way of promoting democracy than imposing outside visions and conditions. Standard recipes may contribute to the reconfiguration of authoritarian rule, but rarely to democratization, and there's a very big difference. Thirdly, participation takes many forms. It's clear that some mechanisms, some legal frameworks, are far more powerful than others. There is, in other words, social and political science at play here, which will help us. But we need to understand that the balance between forms of democracy is changing in front of our eyes, particularly the balance between our traditional notions of representative democracy, elections, parties, and so on, and what people have called participatory or deliberative democracy, the direct involvement of citizens in having their voices heard outside the electoral system. The ceremony of multi-party elections guarantees little by way of long-term social and political gains. It's in that participatory, deliberative area of democracy that a lot of the future lies, we think. And fourthly, civil society and political life are intimately related. We're huge believers in civil society, but it clearly isn't enough. And our experience shows that it's groups in civil society that have strong networks and connections to political actors, like parties, parliaments, Congress, and so on, that are most able to engage new institutions for citizen participation. But how one engages with them in a genuinely non-partisan way, which is very important, obviously, is a dilemma that we struggle with constantly and where we don't actually have an answer. So, does the democracy promotion industry deserve some of the bad press it's currently getting? Or does it not deserve it? I mean, as I travel around the world, I'm increasingly hearing people in the Middle East, for example, talking about democracy as the bombing of Iraq. I mean, literally, counterposing is a definition. In South Asia, democracy is a system for maintaining elite control of the economy that doesn't deliver the goods to ordinary people. Very dangerous. In Africa, of democracy is the failed promise of rigged elections. And across the world, actually, of democracy is a condition for foreign aid or an aspect of diplomacy that is only selectively applied. Given those views, and they're just a sample, I guess the question I would pose is, why would you not be suspicious of democracy promotion? Why would you not be suspicious? That doesn't show a lack of faith in democracy, quite the reverse. People have a passion across the world, but it is an increasing questioning, I think, of narrow versions of what democracy means. And I think that's a good thing. The future of democracy, or more specifically, what kind of democracy prevails, is at stake in countries right across the world. Kenya, Pakistan, Russia, I would argue in the United States as well. And at the heart of that challenge, there's a striking paradox, at least it's striking to me. As democracy expands all over the globe, despite the most recent lull that was referred to, This is a quotation from Yogendra Yadav, who is a political scientist in New Delhi, in a recently released report entitled The State of Democracy in South Asia. As democracy expands all over the globe, our notion of what it means to be democratic may actually have shrunk, foreclosing real possibilities of future political transformation, which is the promise of democracy. That, I think, is a call to all of us to democratize the conversation about democracy. The paradox is that we often have conversations about democracy which are extremely undemocratic, and that lies at the root of our problem. To me, that means three things. First of all, bringing social and economic democracy back into the conversation, because it's largely gone missing over the last 10 years. Democracy, let's remember, requires both freedom and equality, not just freedom. And although freedom is a very popular thing to talk about, often equality gets left off the agenda because our economic system and our political system are often pulling in different directions. So let's have both freedom and equality. There isn't any other basis for a successful democracy. Secondly, let's think much more in terms of those participatory and deliberative experiments that are not just in representation. I'm not arguing against support for representative democracy. That would be stupid. But it's only part of what we're going to encounter going forward. And it's where most of the most interesting innovation and experiments lie. Citizens' forums in Indonesia, for example, participatory budgeting in Brazil is another one. And thirdly, why aren't we more open? Why can't we be more open to learning from non-Western experience of democracy, where those innovations may be stronger? It struck me last year that the Labour government in the United Kingdom imported from Brazil the experiment of citizen participation in local government budgeting into local government inside the United Kingdom. It was a fascinating example of a sort of reverse flow of democratic imagination, which I think could be a very useful guide to the future. Why do I say those things, finally? Because they would lay the basis for a fundamentally different kind of conversation about democracy promotion, which I think would generate much better results in the long term, which is what we say we want to see. It isn't a theoretical conversation. We want to see better results. That will be a conversation that doesn't see democracy as something that is manufactured and exported from one part of the world to another, but something that is co-created, something which is created together across boundaries, learning as we go, where we learn from each other, where no one has a monopoly on the truth. And I think that will be an enterprise with a lot more ethical legitimacy and integrity, a lot more intellectual excitement, and a lot more bite in terms of people's buy-in on the ground. You put those three things together, I think you'll be looking at a different picture for democracy promotion in 25 years' time. Thanks.
So I'm delighted to speak to and talk with all of us tonight because it is the day when we all, I think, should be celebrating a great triumph of democracy in Pakistan. This is really a wonderful accomplishment of the Pakistani people. It's shown great courage and common sense on their part, that they have voted the way they voted, that they had an opportunity to vote. And of course, it's also a time when we're looking at Cuba, a country that's had the same leader, the same dictator for 48 years, but now perhaps, hopefully, faces a different prospect. So I think this is a good moment in history for all of us to be meeting and talking about democracy. You've just seen my good friend Jeremy Kinsman, perhaps the most distinguished Canadian diplomat of his generation, showing that all diplomats are not boring, stodgy human beings. And one of the reasons why it's such a joy to work with Jeremy on this project, on this handbook, is that I think there is an unfortunate perception in the world, not only here in the United States or in Canada, but it's universal in Japan and France and England, that diplomats are boring, that we're great at serving tea or cocktails, we're good at taking messages to foreign ministries, but we're not really with it. We're not down there in the street with the women's movements or the students or the trade unions. We're not part of progress. We're part of sameness. We're part of continuity. And I think what's really extraordinary about our profession, which I'm proud to have been a part, the profession of diplomacy, is that that's not a fully accurate vision, either of our current status or of our history. There are people like Raoul Wallenberg, who many of you here in New York probably know, as a Swedish diplomat, saved tens of thousands of Jews in Hungary at the risk of his life, and eventually sacrificed his life for saving these people. There are many, many other cases, and in our handbook we're going to document, for the first time, I think, actually, in history, document how often diplomats, again, sometimes at the risk of their lives and sometimes at the loss of their lives, have stood with justice, with morality, with freedom. And I think this is an important thing to do because it's important for young people, for Princeton graduate students and undergraduates, for students, I dare say, in this awful place, even for Yale students, my institution. It's important for them to want to do this, to want to go out into the world and represent the best of our societies. I must say, at the same time while I feel that I'm celebrating what happened in Pakistan, I'm also in mourning, because most Pakistanis, my wife is a Punjabi, most Pakistanis believe that the United States was actually opposed to what has just happened in Pakistan, that we were on the side of a dictator. I think that's a moral disgrace that all of us should be ashamed of, that we have communicated that to the Pakistani people and to the people across the Muslim world, to the people in Egypt. I mean, as vice chairman of Freedom House, I'm also with Pam Pelletro's husband working to help Egyptian civil society activists. We just had 7 of them in Washington, and we met with them, and what Bob and I both felt was that they had just seen Condi Rice, and they don't feel that this administration, and it's not just this administration, this has gone back through many administrations, really is on the side of the people in Egypt or in other countries in the Muslim world. And that's a fundamental problem. I mean, many people talk about what we're talking about tonight as some kind of tension between morality and national interest. I think that's just nonsense. I was Henry Kissinger's only speechwriter when he was Secretary of State. I know a lot about realpolitik and national interest arguments. And I used to fight with Henry about this all the time because as an undergraduate at Yale, I was in SNCC and CORE. I was a freedom rider. I was beaten by the police in several states in the South. And I believe passionately that it is in our national interest, our national security interest, to be on the side of change and justice. This is not an issue of good, you know, some kind of naive, youthful, immature American instinct. This has everything to do with what just happened in Pakistan. Look what happened to the Islamic parties on the northwest frontier, to the radical parties. They were all defeated. And anybody who knows Pakistan knows, who knows the fiber of Pakistani society, knows that Pakistanis are not crazy, radical, fundamentalist, you know, wanting to kill their wives or whatever. I mean, these are decent people. This is a decent society. It wants a decent future. And given a decent chance to vote for decent people, will do so. And Pakistanis have shown that for many, many decades. This is not something that's new. Somehow it's new to us. And that's what I find so offensive. And what our project is all about is saying that, you know, we need to be on the side of the people, and that there are very specific things you can do. When I arrived in Budapest in 1986, there was a communist dictator still in power, János Kadar, a classic old-line communist leader. And I felt that it was perfectly possible to have a good relationship with János Kadar, who I used to have scotch with on Saturday mornings, and at the same time meet with the leaders of the democratic movement in Hungary and ask them, as I did in one of my very first meetings, I asked them what I could do for them. I said, I am basically yours. I'm an old-line freedom fighter from the American Civil Rights Movement, and I'm proud to be here as the representative of the American people. I was sent there by Ronald Reagan. I thought this was what he would want me to do. And I said, I want to do what you want me to do. And I think that's the key to what I think we all should be doing. We should be asking the Chinese, the Burmese, the Egyptians, and others, what do they want us to do? We shouldn't tell them what we think they should do. We should ask them, what can we do to help you? That's what I at least tried to do as ambassador. Ultimately, they asked me to march with them in the streets against the communists. I did that. As you can imagine, the communist government of Hungary was not pleased. Moscow called for me to be thrown out, and Jim Baker, who was Secretary of State, called me back and reprimanded me and said if I continued it, I was going to be thrown out by Washington. But I was proud to do it. I thought it was the right thing to do, and our manual basically gives all kinds of examples of similar undiplomatic, diplomatic conduct, of how you can show solidarity within, I think, diplomatic limits. You can do that and still promote trade, investment, broad security dialogue, many other really good things. There's a terrible American phrase, walk and chew gum at the same time. I really believe that in this field you can walk and chew gum at the same time. There's a British ambassador in Uzbekistan, Craig Murray, who wrote a book that some of you may know about called Murder in Samarkand, which Paramount bought. I think this is the first time in the history of diplomacy that a Hollywood studio has bought a book to make a movie. I don't know whether Tom Hanks is going to play this role in the same way that Charlie Wilson's War, that he played so successfully. But let me assure you, if you haven't read Murder in Samarkand and don't know British Ambassador Craig Murray's experience in Tashkent, that it is almost identical to Charlie Wilson in terms of women, drink, and success. I mean, he was a hugely successful, in my book, British ambassador, but partly he was successful because he walked and chewed gum at the same time. He promoted British trade with Uzbekistan, he promoted British security interests, and he really worked hard for Uzbeks who want a better future for their country. He showed the kind of solidarity that Jeremy talks about. He was a not traditional, but in my humble view, traditional diplomat for his country. Let me just say that this country, we're all preoccupied now with campaign season, and some of us are really quite, who are committed to the democracy campaign, of course, are asking ourselves what's going to happen with the new president. I'm actually quite reassured about that. Tony Lake is, as some of you know, Senator Obama's foreign policy advisor. Tony once said to me that the only reason he was sad about leaving the White House, about his job there as the national security advisor to President Clinton, was that he couldn't see through the firm establishment of the community of democracies, which he played a very critical role in getting started. I know that Tony and I know that Senator Obama are deeply committed to this struggle of helping and responding to the requests of Burmese monks, young Egyptians, and others for support. It goes without saying that Senator Clinton also is. Her husband and she have a long history of strong support for the human rights struggle around the world. And Senator McCain, who I've worked with personally for many years, is the chairman of the International Republican Institute, whose only work is promoting democracy around the world. Senator McCain has repeatedly, on the front lines of this struggle, been a leader. So I think all three of the likely next presidents of the United States have a good record, and we should be somewhat reassured in that regard. Let me just, in closing, say that I hope some of you saw the Parade magazine cover article last Sunday. I don't often read Parade magazine, I have to confess, but it's stuffed in the Washington Post, and now for the second or third year in a row, they have had a cover article on the world's 10 worst dictators. And I would urge you, if you haven't thrown it out, to read it, or you can do parade.com you go to the website parade.com. It's a really good piece because it personalizes what I personally think is a personal issue. It is these men like Fidel Castro who do not want to give up power. Fidel has stayed in power for 48 years. Many of the 10 worst dictators have been in power for very long periods. This is an issue really of a few men, no women. There are no women dictators out there. A few men who just want to hold on to power. And I think we need to understand something I could never persuade Henry of, which is that our security is threatened almost exclusively by these men. If you really look at where is the challenge to American national security interests, it comes from a small group of men who are increasingly banding together, this odd club of dictators that's coming into existence, to fight against what we've been talking about and what the world's people really want. And I think that if we understand that dynamic and understand that our task is not to take the place of people in these countries, but to get on their side, then we could see in our lifetimes a world with no more dictators. Thank you.
Sure. I'm Kimberly Martin. I'm from one of those competitor schools. I'm at Barnard College at Columbia. I have an ethical dilemma for you that's a real-world dilemma, and I'm wondering if you can give me an answer to it. I'm part of a contingent from the Harriman Institute at Columbia that is going to Turkmenistan in 3 weeks on the invitation of the government in order to set up an educational exchange program with Columbia. So the people on this exchange program would be chosen by the Turkmenistani government. In today's Columbia Spectator, the student magazine, there was an article that said that we're doing something terrible because we are promoting Turkmenistan, which is a terrible, horrible government, and if we have to go, that at least when we're there, we should just lecture Berdi Muhamedov, the leader of Turkmenistan, about the importance of human rights. What is your take on this?
You should do both things. You should go, and you're not doing it for him, you're doing it for the Turkmenistan students. The inconvenience is they're picking them, and you've got to make it very clear that they've got to, there can't be any ringers in there, I used to be an ambassador to Turkmenistan when the Soviet Union fell apart, and I can only express deep sympathy with your dilemma. But I think it'll be a good thing for some people from Turkmenistan, but you really do have to speak to them about human rights, and I bet they'll be polite. And you're tall, and I think it'll be okay, and you'll probably come back to Barnard,
Mark?
I think this is the issue that Lauren Mazel is facing with the New York Philharmonic going to North Korea. It's basically the same question. And as somebody who lived in dictatorships myself for 14 years, the question I think is quite simple, and that is, do dictators thrive in countries that are open, that have exchanges and symphonies and stuff going on, or do they thrive in countries that are closed? And any of us who know anything about dictatorships know the answer to that. So we should do everything we can to open them up. And administrations or any other bodies that argue for not dealing with them, not opening up, are just simply wrong.
And I think there are plenty of precedents for the value of those exchanges over time. I mean, I cite Vietnam as a very good case, where Ford, in somewhat unpromising circumstances, I would guess, started a very similar exchange program 10, 12 years ago, which was difficult to start with, precisely because of the issue of who was chosen and why and so on. But I have to say, over some years, it's turned out to be, I think, a tremendous success. And over time, the selection criteria tend to change because you get to know each other and things, there's a natural flexibility that you can exploit in the system. So I would definitely encourage you to go for it. It could be really, really important.
Sir.
Let me throw out to you, just trying to think outside the box. I personally believe that our ability to influence events in the rest of the world is by definition limited. And to evoke George Kennan, if I read him correctly, I think he did too. And thinking outside the box, what is your reaction if all you guys are very well-meaning, but all of us have finite energies and resources? And what would be the result if the world and the United States, if we spent much more of our time trying to make our own country a better place? You see where I'm going with this question. Rather than trying to influence events halfway around the world, where to many people our very presence there is the problem. I don't want to make a speech, but you know what I'm saying. So, but I'd like you to approach, if you just let your mind wander, what if you did a 180-degree turn and said, I don't want to make a speech, you know where I'm going with this.
Maybe I'll take a first crack at this. I don't think it makes a whole lot, not much of a contribution to pose that as a choice. We're obviously going to do both. We're obviously going to focus on our internal problems. The amount of time and money and resources that we spend on democracy promotion efforts, even broadly conceived, is minuscule, and as far as I can read, the public mood will remain minuscule. It's really a question of how we use those resources to try to be helpful around the world. And I think we can learn from some successful experiences. Having been Deputy Director of Radio Free Europe back when I was a youngster in my early 30s, I often get hit with the question of how can we replicate Radio Free Europe somewhere else? It's either the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, or Radio Free Europe that's supposed to be relevant to some other problem. And focusing on Radio Free Europe, I look at the ingredients of success of that operation, which were very specific to that region. It was seen as legitimate. It was seen as acting in the interest of those to whom it was providing a service. It was seen as providing a service that wasn't being provided domestically by anyone else. And it was not being seen as the purveyor of naked American interests in some other guise. There's a few other conditions that go along with it, but those conditions are rarely met. And when they are, success is more likely than when they aren't.
I might just add that democracy work is really cheap. It's really cheap. It doesn't cost a lot of money. We have embassies in almost, in terms of all democratic countries, we have embassies for a variety of reasons anyway in all of these countries. And diplomats should do something, and they're paid. So, it actually doesn't cost much extra to do what I, at least, am arguing we do. I'm not arguing we lavish money on other countries. I'm just saying I think our diplomats ought to do what I think is their duty, which is to promote, to be responsive to the requests from local people for support.
Well, at the risk of making the whole conversation political, which, but at least it'll make it more interesting. How do you react that our perception in the Mideast is, as the president said, to spread democracy, and it's not honest, it's really about oil.
Well, the
And
fact is,
if it's not honest, and it's flawed, and the whole debate is, there's not an honest discussion, or because it is about oil.
well, I think there's a lot of truth in what you just said. I think there is no consistent policy in support of democracy in the Middle East.
The discussion is not honest.
That's correct. I agree
But
with
you
that.
know, if I may say, there's a lot more to it than this discussion, okay? I was thinking more about what Kim was saying. In many ways, what makes the most impact on people in other countries about America, if that's what you're talking about, is not necessarily the American government. It's Americans. And I can tell you, as somebody who's lived most of his life in other places, that Americans abroad today are not Americans abroad 35 years ago. And I think of what I said to Kim. I should have said something about the Chinese kids today at the Woodrow Wilson School. They're not the Chinese kids who came 25 years ago, who were these scared, kind of closed, almost sort of touchingly dysfunctional kids. Now they're taller than you, I have to say. They hate their government. They're healthy, And there are a lot of Americans I see abroad today, including people our age, who are working in different volunteer functions, people in the American military, people in so many different NGOs who are communicating something about America. I think that if you're looking for what's going to heal outside the box, yeah, sure, there's some problems in this country as there are in every country, but I think Americans have a better sense now of their limitations. And going back to what Michael was saying, an ability to learn from other people, too.
Sir, with all due respect,
Let's move that. Nobody can answer your question. It's too hard for us.
what if we turned all this energy and intelligence and goodwill to solving the ghetto problems of the American cities?
I hope you do. I hope you do, but not all of it, because the world is complex.
Question in the middle?
Thank you. My name is Sheila Katzman, and I would like to hear from any of you there for you to describe for me what is an ideal democracy. And I ask this because I am coming from a peacekeeping, UN peacekeeping point of view, where in most of the countries that we've been in, we try to promote, the West tried to promote this government of unity. In Liberia, for instance, we had this interim government where we rewarded those rebel leaders to these great offices. We did the same in Sierra Leone. And what we see in Pakistan is that Pakistan is trying to do this on their own now. But later on, we find out that these things doesn't really work. Yet the people who suffer from these conflicts, especially women and children, there were no provisions for them. In our peacekeeping until 2001 or thereabout, we never started looking at the rebel brides or anything like that. And all the policies were coming from outside. Things have changed a little now, but I'd like to know about this ideal democracy that you're talking about, just for me to, or for us in here to understand a little better. And just one last point, that it is true, I'm from Jamaica, and I remembered before that the government, the U.S. Embassy was so distant from the people. Now you find that, yes, the civil society promotion, the giving to youth, women, whether it has to do with HIV/AIDS, the MDGs or other, it's just so open now, and it's so really beautiful that it's, even though most of the ambassadors that I've met are really retired, who have been called back into service or something like that. Thank you.
If I could just put a little turn to the question, because all three of the speakers went out of their way to explain they didn't believe there was any ideal democracy. We can stipulate that. Nobody on the panel believes that. And I think they all said, too, that they don't believe that democracy should be imposed from outside. But here's where I think your question is. The practice has always been quite different, that there is an effort, almost unstoppable effort, to impose an idea from outside, whether it's Ahmed Chalabi or some other solution or it's Joe Biden's idea that we ought to partition Iraq, as if policymakers in Washington ought to figure that out. There's this compunction. So rather than answer it in the abstract, I know you're all opposed to the idea of imposing democracy, but how in practice do you begin to shift the way at least Americans practice democracy promotion towards something that really does recognize the authenticity of what's going on inside a country?
Well, I think your question answers itself, Bob. I mean, the democracy that's ideal is the one that the people of that country choose, okay? That's just obviously fundamental. And over time, and we've written about this, many people have written about it, and there are several basic agreements. There's a difference of view whether there has to be a multi-party system, but obviously there have to be constitutional or some kind of guarantees for minorities. There has to be an independent judiciary. There should be independent media. There are a variety of institutions that go with it. There has to be transparency. There has to be the perception by people of fairness, and of access. And all of these things take time. And it's very ragged and uneven, as you know from your work. And look at the hell we're going through in Afghanistan right now, because you can't even start until you have security. And unfortunately, when you have security and you have the military, then you're taking a lot of steps, make it awful hard to have transparency and fairness, and the urgencies of violence can sometimes take over. So no one said it was easy. It's not easy, but there's no alternative on behalf of the people who live there but to keep trying.
I think I have time to only take two more questions. I saw one there and then one in the middle. Let's take the one back there first, and then you're the last one. He's got to.
Let's follow up on your question and sharpen a little bit, perhaps. Here we have a situation in the world of failed states, right and left, of ethnic genocide, of dictatorships of the majority, and so on. How do you build these democracies? in a situation where it's not just encouraging in a state of, of stability, democratic forces that are trying to move forward, but when you have this kind of situation in Darfur or Kenya or Yugoslavia, how do you build that into a democracy? What does democracy building look like? And maybe if we developed that and explored that, it would make it a little bit easier to get beyond the question of how do you get agreement to intervene if by force, if by necessary, if necessity. So after force, after intervention, is there room for some updated, modern notion of a protectorate or a mandate, or somehow for the international community to govern a society for some years, maybe a decade, while it builds the institutions that can lead to democracy?
I've been given the most difficult question to reply to. Well, I mean, it's the right question. You know, we have to look at the most difficult cases in all of this, see if they work. First of all, obviously, there's no magic bullet in those cases. There is literally no way of making them right through any sort of external assistance. So the tragic fact of the matter is that large numbers of people will continue to suffer in those situations, which is not an excuse for inaction, but it's a recognition that whatever you do will have complications. The second point I would make was in those cases, I think there are two things that can be done, and they should go together. The first is doing what you can to continue to build and sustain the internal conditions for some form of functioning democracy, because people always organize everywhere. They always take collective action in defense of their interests. They all have visions of where they want their society to go, which they're prepared to sacrifice for. And picking up on that basic energy, I would call it a basic human energy, gives you something to start with, something to support, something to nurture, even though it will be continually opposed, stamped out, and people will be arrested, imprisoned, killed, and so on for expressing those basic desires. But at some level, that is irrepressible because it's in our DNA. At least that would be my belief. That will be the first thing, to do whatever you can and do it as well as you can to help to sustain those internal conditions. Secondly, and this is where governments come in, is to change the boundary conditions, which isn't something that civil society or individuals can do by themselves. And I mean more than the sort of heroic actions by diplomats, which we've heard about, which are absolutely crucial, but getting more serious about the realpolitik aspect of things. There are certain things that powerful governments can try to do, even if they have an imperfect outcome. And one of the reasons why we're not making more progress in a number of countries, I will put Egypt in that category, Saudi Arabia elsewhere, is that governments are not doing enough at that level to change the boundary conditions with the power that they have beyond being effective diplomats. Even if you add all that together, your chances are slim. But that's what you have to do. Otherwise, we sit on our hands and worry and wait. So it's not a satisfactory answer, I think, to the question, but it's an honest one, at least from our own experience.
Last question. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you. This is Sylviane Zahil from L'Orient du Jour, Beirut.
Bonjour.
In Beirut. My question is, what is at stake right now in Lebanon, and what is the real agenda behind democracy in the Middle East?
Madame, ce n'est pas mon pays qui prône la démocratie dans le Moyen-Orient. Je passe à mon collègue.
I think part of the question is who are you talking about? Whose agenda? There are lots of different agendas, obviously. If you're talking about the Bush administration's agenda, which is increasingly uninteresting because it's not very much longer left for it, or are you talking about the West in general or people in the region or whatever? But let me just say about Lebanon, where I have spent some serious time, that I think the Lebanese people very much want to be a functioning, peaceful, prosperous democracy. It is a remarkable country with immense talent, with this terrible divide, which I think foreigners have contributed to, not only Iran and Syria, which are today contributing massively to it, but I think the West has contributed as well. My own feeling, having spent a lot of years now trying to build television stations in the Middle East, is that there's a new generation emerging in all of these countries Lebanon, it's not so new. It's been there for a long time. But I recently did focus groups in Saudi Arabia with young Saudis, 15 to 19, 19 to 25, et cetera, women and men. And the word they most often used was modern, that they want to be modern. I think there is the same kind of revolution at the societal level going on in the Middle East that we saw, those of us who worked in the bad old days, Bob and I, in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the same kind of revolution in culture, in education, in attitudes about women. Many areas, that revolution is underway in the Middle East, and therefore I am basically very optimistic about the future, but the course of getting there, of course, is very fraught with violence and a lot of terrible things.
Let me offer a brief addendum, since I actually worked not very happily in the current administration as a kind of internal critic. There was an idea, and the idea was, and of course there are many, many motivations, but the dominant intellectual idea, if you can call it that, was that after 9/11, the witch's brew of combination of factors in the greater Middle East was intolerably dangerous for the American national interests, and that was 3 or 4 regimes bent on developing weapons of mass destruction, and other regimes, even friendly ones, Saudi Arabia, for example, being training grounds, talent pools for a new generation of terrorists. This is the concept. So the concept was to punish and discipline the recalcitrants and bring democracy to the rest. Now, to my taste, this was a monumental arrogance that got us into huge trouble. And the question now is, on the wreckage of these policies, how can we effectively go about, again, the business of promoting good neighborliness, political pluralism, at the end of the day, maybe even democracy in this region after all that's going on. And I, too, am hopeful that we may be on a better track soon.
You know, thinking about the last question, too, and post-conflict, failed state situations, what do you want? What's the formula? And I think very much of the tragedy of Lebanon. You want someone who can lead. Unfortunately, one of the great defects of unprepared democratic governance is that people go and get elected on the backs of a majority hatred of the other, or of a national hatred of the neighbor, okay? That is the problem. It's the problem in Lebanon. It's the problem in so many countries. It's a problem right now, and you can't even count the countries. And if there's one thing you can do, if you're going to go and think out of the box, it is to try to demonstrate the ability of people in this country, or other countries like my country, or settlement immigration countries, of which there are very few, in reconciling people and in getting leaders who will seek office and election on the basis of something other than this abject, vindictive, ethnic populism, like Milosevic, okay? That's, I think, what all of the programs that these guys at the Ford Foundation or National Endowment of Democracy, International Republican Institute, I think that that's what they're all about. And that's honestly what we have to hope for, if that makes sense.
I want to thank all of you for your patience and your questions, and please join me in thanking the panel.